The Second World War reshaped the global economy in ways that are still felt today. While millions of ordinary citizens endured rationing, bombings, and economic hardship, a select group of American families emerged from the conflict wealthier than ever. These were not soldiers on the front lines or small business owners struggling to survive. They were industrialists, financiers, and members of elite capital families who had positioned themselves to profit from the machinery of war. Their gains were not accidental. They were the result of careful planning, political connections, and a system that rewarded those who controlled resources, production, and finance. Before the United States officially entered the war, these families had already begun to capitalize on opportunities created by global instability. Corporations they controlled supplied materials to both Allied and Axis powers, often through intermediaries and overseas subsidiaries that obscured direct involvement. Steel, oil, and chemical companies expanded production in anticipation of contracts that would later be guaranteed by government war spending. Wealthy financiers facilitated loans to governments, underwritten by taxpayer money, which not only profited them during the conflict, but ensured influence over post-war reconstruction. These families did not simply benefit from war. They actively structured their businesses to make wealth inevitable, insulating themselves from the risks that devastated other sectors of the economy. One critical avenue of wealth accumulation was government contracts. The U.S. government became the largest purchaser of goods and services in the world almost overnight, and established families with established industrial empires were uniquely positioned to supply munitions, vehicles, machinery, and raw materials. Firms such as General Motors, Standard Oil, and DuPont expanded operations exponentially, often receiving preferential treatment due to political lobbying and existing networks of influence. Contracts were sometimes awarded with minimal oversight, allowing executives to maximize profits while simultaneously securing control over strategic industries. In some cases, labor shortages were resolved by employing imported workers or exploiting marginalized populations, further reducing costs and increasing margins. Financial maneuvering was equally crucial. Banks and investment firms controlled by these families offered financing packages, war bonds, and complex derivatives tied to government expenditures. They were able to extract enormous profits by arbitraging currency, controlling commodity markets, and structuring deals that transferred risk to the public while keeping gains private. The lines between public interest and private profit blurred, as policy decisions often favored industries and individuals already entrenched in power. In this environment, the accumulation of wealth was not incidental. It was engineered, coordinated, and amplified by access to information and decision-making channels that ordinary citizens could never reach. These families also extended their reach internationally. Allied nations relied heavily on U.S. supply chains, creating opportunities for American corporations to secure long-term contracts that would persist even after the war ended. In occupied and liberated territories, American companies were positioned to acquire assets at discounted rates, purchase distressed businesses, and exert influence over reconstruction efforts. Political connections ensured that they could navigate regulatory frameworks and secure favorable exchange rates, while competitors without these networks faced barriers or outright exclusion. The result was a concentration of wealth in a relatively small number of families, whose fortunes expanded by multiples during a period of global upheaval. After the war, the fortunes these families had built during the conflict did not simply plateau. They expanded further through reconstruction, industrial consolidation, and the emerging Cold War economy. Europe lay in ruins, and the Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into rebuilding Allied nations. Many American industrialists and financiers were directly involved in supplying materials, machinery, and expertise, often through companies and banks they controlled. These contracts, funded by U.S. taxpayers, generated profits at an extraordinary scale, while simultaneously cementing long-term influence over strategic sectors. The same families who had thrived during wartime now became central to post-war global capitalism, shaping industries from oil and steel to aerospace and chemicals. Political connections remained essential. Relationships cultivated during wartime with government officials, military planners, and policy advisors enabled these families to anticipate policy shifts and secure privileged access to resources. Lobbying ensured favorable tax treatments, regulatory exemptions, and priority in government procurement. Insider knowledge of economic trends and strategic planning allowed them to acquire undervalued assets, such as European companies devastated by bombing campaigns, and convert them into highly profitable enterprises. Wealth, in this context, was not simply inherited. It was actively engineered through a combination of influence, timing, and strategic risk-taking that ordinary investors could never replicate. Financial networks played a decisive role as well. Banks and investment firms linked to these families manipulated credit flows, war bonds, and post-war reconstruction loans, often profiting from the differential between risk and government-backed guarantees. By channeling funds through complex instruments and offshore accounts, they minimized exposure while maximizing returns. Some of the largest post-war mergers and acquisitions involved companies whose wartime expansion had been underwritten by these very families. This allowed them to consolidate industries, eliminate competitors, and retain control over markets critical to both domestic and international economies. Furthermore, the Cold War created new avenues for accumulation. Defense spending, nuclear research, aerospace development, and global logistics offered endless opportunities for corporations and financiers already positioned at the top. Families who had profited during World War II were able to leverage political relationships to secure government contracts that would last for decades, ensuring that wartime gains translated into multi-generational wealth. This cycle of profit, influence, and strategic placement ensured that their fortunes continued to grow even as the world moved from open conflict to ideological competition. The story of these capital families illustrates a pattern that few ever fully acknowledge. Immense wealth can be generated, hidden, and perpetuated through crises, war, and reconstruction. While the public often focuses on heroism, tragedy, or ideological battles, the mechanisms of wealth accumulation operate quietly behind the scenes. Millions endured scarcity, destruction, and displacement, yet a select few navigated the same events to emerge stronger, wealthier, and more influential. The scale, timing, and secrecy of their actions mean that even today, many are unaware of how profoundly World War II shaped the fortunes of a small number of American families, whose influence and wealth continue to reverberate through modern economies.